Good morning. Welcome to Northwest Unitarian Universalist Church. If you are a visitor, I'd like to extend a special welcome to you today and invite you to fill out the visitors form in the chat box so we can stay in touch with you. If you're having any problems with Zoom this morning, you can chat with our tech hosts. Your calendar probably says that today is Independence Day, the celebration of the birth of the United States. But we all know that there were many nations on the land the U.S. occupies. Our guest speaker this morning is Heather Bruegl, a citizen of one of those nations, the United Nation of Wisconsin, and the Director of Cultural Affairs at Stockbridge Muncie Community. She is a historian who is passionate about all things history, but especially Native American history. We're fortunate to have the opportunity to hear Heather's collective perspective this morning on embracing our collective past and how we can do better. I'm your worship associate, Diana Kohler. Ken Hermanot prepared our music for the morning, and he and Ben Gable are our technical co-hosts for this morning's service. I light our chalice this morning with these words from Maya Angelou. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. Lift up your eyes upon the day breaking for you. Give birth again to the dream. Let us settle into our time of worship with this territorial acknowledgement by the Reverend Sean Neil Barron. We gather together as a community of seekers to honor the interdependence of life, to respect the dignity of all, and to honor the land we walk humbly upon. Friends, let us acknowledge that our building rests upon the traditional territories of the Three Fires Council, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi, the original nations of this land who continue to cry out for justice and self-determination. We are blessed with a space and opportunity to strive to live out our principles, to bring justice, equity, and compassion into our daily lives, to resist all that threatens the earth and her people, and to live out our dream of a world community of peace, liberty, and justice for all. Let these thoughts carry us forth as we journey and worship together. Blessed be.
We are building Peace and freedom is our cry. Peace and freedom is our cry. Without these, this world would die. Peace and freedom is our cry.
And our guest speaker is Heather Bruegl.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here today to do this service. When I first agreed to do this, I didn't realize it was the 4th of July. So that kind of changed what I was going to talk about. But first, I want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the ancestral homelands of my ancestors, the Mahikaniak people, the Mohicans. I am currently just outside Hudson, New York. And so I've been very honored to be traveling the homelands this past week and this week coming up. So I'm very honored to be able to do that. So I will be sharing 2 different parts with you guys today. And considering that it is the 4th of July, I feel like it's important that we understand our past and that we embrace it. So I just first want to start with this. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I think it's kind of important to understand that last part. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, we know when the Declaration was written, it was written, obviously, in 1776, all men are created equal. But what were they really talking about when they said all men are created equal? They weren't talking about the indigenous people who inhabited the land hundreds of years before colonization started. They weren't talking about the enslaved people that were forced from their homes to come and work in servitude. They weren't talking about women who gave birth to these great leaders. They weren't talking about the poor or indentured servants. They were talking about themselves, the aristocracy, the white, wealthy landowners. That's who they were talking about. They weren't talking about anybody else. And then when they were talking about throwing off the shackles of oppression from Great Britain, it was really a discussion on who was going to colonize the land that the indigenous people were already on. My ancestors, as I am of Oneida and Mohican descent, my ancestors were the ones who helped fight in the American Revolution. The Stockbridge Militia, which was created through Stockbridge Mohicans, fought in the Bronx, the Battle of Kingsbridge, Saratoga, and the Siege of Boston. My ancestors, the Oneida, helped break the famine at Valley Forge. If we hadn't been there, what would have happened? Would the United States eventually have been formed? Would those colonists have won? I kind of, as a historian, think that maybe it would have gone a different route. And then after winning that revolution, that great victory, throwing off the shackles of oppression, they then in turn became the oppressors. And one of the ways they became the oppressors is through the form of government that they founded. The United States government is modeled off the government of the Haudenosaunee, people of the Longhouse. My ancestors. That is how this government started. It is important to understand that history, important to embrace it, and important to understand that it was then later used against Native nations. For a long time, we were forced onto reservations. We were forced to be able to, or not be able to have our own form of government unless we formed that form of government after the model of the United States, which was formed after us. So when we think about freedom, it's trying to think about who's freedom for? What is freedom about? Who were they talking about? Because it clearly was not the indigenous peoples of the United States. I don't say any of this to dog on anybody's celebrations that they might have today, but understanding what does that freedom mean? You know, Frederick Douglass gave a speech on what does the 4th of July mean to an enslaved person, because it didn't have freedom. Who were they talking about? John Quinney, one of my Mohican ancestors, gave a speech on July 4th, 1854 in Reidsville, New York. So probably I think about an hour from where I currently am, where he talks about the land that was taken from the Mohican people. After we helped fight in the American Revolution, helped the colonists win, we were then forced out of our homelands. So who was really free? Native Americans were not made citizens of the United States until 1924. Citizens of the land that we were born on, that we cultivated, that we stewarded. Not until 1924 were we made citizens. To put that in perspective, my grandfather was 11 years old in 1924, and he was not a citizen of the country to which he was born in. Native Americans serve in the military, in the armed forces at a higher rate per capita than any other group in the United States. And Indigenous women serve at a higher rate in the armed forces than any other female group in the United States. It's in our blood, it's in our DNA. We're warriors, we're protectors. And that's one way that we can carry on our traditions, from being forced off of our homelands, to being forced onto the reservation system, to not being made citizens, to being denied the right to vote, and to have our land again threatened today. So when we talk about the 4th of July, when we talk about freedom, when we talk about who are they talking about, it's important to understand that they're not talking about my ancestors. They're not talking about me. They were talking about the white aristocracy, the land-holding people who would have been some of our greatest founding fathers: George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Ben Franklin, Alexander Hamilton. It's not saying that what these men did wasn't extraordinary, but they didn't do it alone, and they were flawed, 100% flawed. I think when we look back to the past and we look at history, I think we have a tendency to put these leaders on pedestals and try to only look at the best and see what they have done. But it's important to note that they were just flawed individuals like you and I, who at an extraordinary time were given a set of circumstances and they did something with it. They had the opportunity to do great things. They didn't always do it. George Washington, first president of the United States, leader of the Continental Army, was a slave holder who hunted his slaves who escaped until the day that he died. Thomas Jefferson, author of probably the greatest breakup letter of all time, the Declaration of Independence, held over 300 people captive at Monticello and constructed the Louisiana Purchase, which gave way to Andrew Jackson to be able to sign the Indian Removal Act into law in 1830 to move all of our people from their territories in the East to Indian Territory in Oklahoma. John Adams, who was not a slave owner, mind you, he was one of the few founding fathers who was not a slave owner, but when he was president, signed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which kind of stifled that very first Bill of Rights amendment, the freedom of speech. If you spoke out against your country in a time of war, you could be punished. Abraham Lincoln suspended the right of habeas corpus during the Civil War, which, you know, habeas corpus literally means bring me the body. It kind of stifled your rights to due process and being able to have a, fair trial. So throughout this time, voices have been stifled by these great men. And I say men because that seems to be all we talk about, is we talk about the founding fathers. We never talk about the founding mothers. We never talk about, Dolly Madison, except in terms of saving George Washington's portrait during the War of 1812, or Abigail Adams and her great many letters filled with advice to John Adams, talking about when this is founding, don't forget the ladies. I have a coffee mug that says, remember the ladies, you know? But in another way, we have to remember, she was talking about remember the white ladies, not remember the indigenous women, the indigenous mothers who were trying to feed their babies as they're being forced off their land. So I think it's important when we are talking about the 4th of July today in 2021, just as it was super important last year during the summer, that I like to say was a second civil rights movement that was happening for social justice after the untimely murder of George Floyd. It's important to remember whose freedom are we actually talking about? Because it's not mine. We're not celebrating my freedom today. We're not celebrating the freedom of my ancestors today. We're celebrating the freedom of a group that just seems to keep getting smaller, but holds all of the power. So yeah, that's just that's part one of my little talk. I'm going to go into a little bit more in part two, where we're going to talk a little bit more about current issues going on in the Indigenous community today. But I do want to say thank you very much for allowing me to be part of your service. And I look forward to seeing you again in a few minutes.
Spirit of life, come unto me, sing in my heart all the stirrings of compassion, blow in the wind, rise in the sea, move in the hand, giving life the shape of justice. Roots hold me close, wings set me free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me.
He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. These words were written by Thomas Jefferson, and they reside in the Declaration of Independence, where he refers to our frontiers. Ownership is a concept that we don't have in Indigenous communities. We don't own land. We're stewards of it. We take care of it. We're borrowing it from our children. We're here to protect it for the next 7 generations. But you have right here in this document where we're referred to as merciless Indian savages. Merciless Indian savages. We're the ones that are apparently war hungry and on the war path and, you know, want destruction, when all we really wanted was acknowledgement of our existence, acknowledgement of our homes, acknowledgement of us just being there and being the original inhabitants of this land. In 1830, Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, which led to the Trail of Tears, which led to thousands upon thousands of Indigenous people being moved from the southeastern part of the United States to what is now present-day Oklahoma, where thousands more died along the way of disease, cold, and hunger. In 1609, Henry Hudson sailed down the Mahicanatuck, which you know as the Hudson River, and the colonization of my ancestors started with the introduction of trade and then with being forced off of our land. In 1887, the Dawes Act was signed, and the Dawes Act was something that took those reservations that we were forced upon and then broke them up into allotments. Anything that was considered surplus land was then sold to non-native settlers. We weren't considered citizens of the United States until 1924. Again, my grandfather was 11 years old when this happened. In 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act was signed. And this act attempted to give us some sort of autonomy in our tribal governments, in our courts, in running our schools, and in possibly getting some of our land back. But then in 1954, the United States government introduced a policy of termination, which then severed treaty obligations and again stole land from the indigenous people of the United States. 109 tribes lost their tribal status, lost federal funding, lost schools, lost Indian health services, were forced off of reservations during the 1956 Relocation Act, where you were kind of forced to move to the cities with no guarantee of finding a job. So you left one poverty-stricken area and to go into another poverty-stricken area where you faced racial segregation, discrimination. You didn't see anyone who looked like you. You didn't see anyone who maybe spoke the same language that you spoke, maybe had the same cultures and traditions that you spoke. It wasn't until 1974 that the policy of termination was ended. It wasn't until 1978 that we could freely and openly practice our religion again. The religion of Native Americans was banned well into the late 1800s. We couldn't freely practice. And many of our religious sites are located in what are now national parks. There's a really good article that I encourage you to read. It was on April's cover edition of The Atlantic about how the national parks should be restored back to the indigenous people. Not so that we can close them and won't allow you in. We want you to see these beautiful lands. But who better to steward these lands than the original owners of these lands, the original inhabitants of these lands, than us? And many of our sacred sites are in these national parks, in Yellowstone, near Bear Butte, in Teddy Roosevelt National Park, in Yosemite. These are all important sacred sites to us, but because of their beauty or their natural resources were stolen. One thing that I do want to address is in the mid to late 1800s through the 1990s, the United States and Canada had a residential school and boarding school system that I feel is super timely to talk about, considering that in Canada alone, we have found over 1,505 remains of children who died at these residential schools at the hands of these residential school workers. It's important to note the church's role, in particular the Catholic Church, but religious roles in general, in the deterioration and of our culture, of our language, and our traditions. I am only one generation removed from a boarding school. My grandparents were boarding school survivors, and the boarding school that they went to was a religious-run boarding school in the state of Wisconsin. And I think it's important to note that while the churches may have thought that they were doing some sort of good, they weren't. The harm is still felt today in 2021. And I encourage you to look at the Truth and Reconciliation reports from Canada, from the Canadian government, where they have talked about what happened at these residential schools. I won't go into too much detail because it's quite traumatic. But Canada did a study with the residential school survivors, and it came to be known as Truth and Reconciliation. And I am excited to see that in the United States, our Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, who is Laguna Pueblo, has authorized an initiative to look at the boarding school policies here in the United States as well. I have a funny suspicion, though, that if Deb Haaland was not our Secretary of the Interior, the United States, again, would just continue to look the other way and not embrace and learn from what happened in the past. I have that same suspicion when it comes to the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Task Force, that again, if Deb Haaland was not our Secretary of the Interior, these things would not be something that we would be looking at. And it's important to look at these. It's important to understand the past, understand where we've been in order to understand where we are going and how we keep repeating that same cycle. You get asked a lot of times because I do, in all honesty and full disclosure, have a really great love of early colonial history. I love the founding of this country and everything that goes along with it, whether that is the Declaration of Independence or the Constitutional Convention or the forming of the government based on the Haudenosaunee values. I love just that beginning of it. It's super exciting to me. When I was in college, I wrote my dissertation on Thomas Jefferson, so that stuff is very fascinating to me. But I think what we do in this country, where we can't even have a discussion about critical race theory without someone getting ticked off, is we're not learning from that past. It is important to understand that past and where we have been in order to understand where we are going and not to commit the same mistakes again, which we continuously do. I'm oftentimes asked, because of my love of early colonial history, when do I think America was great? And my answer to that is never. I do not believe we were ever great. I don't believe we are great now. I believe we have all of the tools at our fingertips to become great. But until we embrace those tools, until we look at our past, until we understand what we have done and acknowledge it and say two simple words, I'm sorry, I hear you, I acknowledge you. Until we can do that, we will never be great. Once we do that, the doors open and the possibilities are endless. We are an eclectic nation with groups that are thriving and beautiful and should be embraced. I always get very upset when somebody says we're a melting pot, because we are not a melting pot. A melting pot implies that we've all melded together. We're not a melting pot. Professor in college taught me that we're more of a salad. In a salad, you can see the tomatoes and the lettuce and the cucumbers and whatever else you want to throw in your salad. Here in the United States, we're a country where we can see the indigenous people and the Latinx people and the Black people and the Muslims and the Jews and the Christians. We can see all of that, and we should embrace it all. We should learn from each other. But until we can actually do that, until we can acknowledge that past, that's not going to happen. So I implore everyone today, while you are out celebrating at your barbecues, because I don't want you to not celebrate the 4th of July, but I want you to understand the meaning behind it and who it was really written for, who the Declaration was really written for and written about, and what the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness actually meant at the time. Now, I believe the documents like the Declaration and the Constitution are living and breathing documents. They change with the times. So I believe now we encompass that. But let's stop and think about, at the very beginning when those words were written, who we were actually talking about. And when you are out celebrating today, I do ask that you do keep those 1,505 souls in your hearts and raise them up, because we are finally being able to bring them home. And that's just all we've ever wanted to do. So again, I thank you very much for allowing me to be part of your Sunday service. I hope to work with you guys all again soon. And, in my most serious thank you. And I do wish you a happy 4th of July. So again, thank you to Diana, Ben, and everyone for allowing me to be part of this service today. And I hope that I haven't bummed you out too much, but that I've left you with some things to think about and to learn on and to go out and explore. So thank you.
And thank you too. Our next hymn is called We Begin Again in Love, and it's a spoken prayer and a sung response, where if you want to sing along, the words to respond to is, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love, after each of the parts of the prayer that the narrator presents. And you'll hear that I'm doing both parts for you, but you can sing along with the congregational response.
for remaining silent when a single voice would have made a difference. We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For each time that our fears have made us rigid and inaccessible, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For each time we have struck out in anger without just cause, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For each time that our greed has blinded us to the needs of others, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For the selfishness that set us apart and alone, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For falling short of the admonitions of the Spirit, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For losing sight of our unity, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For those and for so many acts, both evident and subtle, which have fueled the illusion of separateness, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
We close our service with the words of Reverend Kimberly Quinn Johnson. We are the ones we have been waiting for. We are not perfect, but we are perfectly fitted for this day. We are not without fault, but we can be honest to face our past as we chart a new future. We are the ones we've been waiting for. May we be bold and courageous to chart that new future. May we have faith in a future that is not known. We are the ones we have been waiting for.